Chapter 5. The next evening old Mr. Sillerton Jackson came to dine with the Archers. Mrs. Archer was a shy woman, and shrank from society, but she liked to be well informed as to its doings. Her old friend, Mr. Sillerton Jackson, applied to the investigation of his friend's affairs the patience of a collector and the science of a naturalist. And his sister, Miss Sophie Jackson, who lived with him and was entertained by all the people who could not secure her much sought-after brother, brought home bits of minor gossip that filled in usefully the gaps in his picture. Therefore, whenever anything happened that Mrs. Archer wanted to know about, she asked Mr. Jackson to dine. And as she honored few people with her invitations, and as she and her daughter Janie were an excellent audience, Mr. Jackson usually came himself instead of sending his sister. If he could have dictated all the conditions, he would have chosen the evenings when Newland was out. Not because the young man was uncongenial to him, the two got on capitally at the club, but because the old anecdotist sometimes felt, on Newland's part, a tendency to weigh his evidence that the ladies of the family never showed. Mr. Jackson, if perfection had been attainable on earth, would also have asked that Mrs. Archer's food should be a little better. But then New York, as far back as the mind of man could travel, had been divided into the two great fundamental groups of the Mingotts and the Mansons, and all their clan, who cared about eating and clothes and money, and the Archer, Newland, van der Luyden tribe, who were devoted to travel, horticulture, and the best fiction, and looked down on the grosser forms of pleasure. You couldn't have everything after all. If you dined with the Lovell Mingotts, you got canvasback and terrapin and vintage wines. At Adelaide Archer's, you could talk about alpine scenery and the marble faun, and luckily the Archer Madeira had gone round the Cape. Therefore, when a friendly summons came from Mrs. Archer, Mr. Jackson, who was a true eclectic, would usually say to his sister, "I've been a little gouty since my last dinner at the Lovell Mingotts. It'll do me good to dine at Adeline's." Mrs. Archer, who had long been a widow, lived with her son and daughter in West 28th Street. An upper floor was dedicated to Newland, and the two women squeezed themselves into narrower quarters below. In an unclouded harmony of tastes and interests, they cultivated ferns in Wardian cases, made macrame lace and wool embroidery on linen, collected American Revolutionary glazed ware, subscribed to good words, and read Ouida's novels for the sake of the Italian atmosphere. They preferred those about peasant life, because of the descriptions of scenery and the pleasanter sentiments, though in general they liked novels about people in society, whose motives and habits were more comprehensible, spoke severely of Dickens, who had never drawn a gentleman, and considered Thackeray less at home in the great world than Bulwer, who, however, was beginning to be thought old-fashioned. Mrs. and Miss Archer were both great lovers of scenery. It was what they principally sought and admired on their occasional travels abroad, considering architecture and painting as subjects for men, and chiefly for learned persons who read Ruskin. Mrs. Archer had been born a Newland, and mother and daughter, who were as like as sisters, were both, as people said, true Newlands, tall, pale, and slightly round-shouldered, with long noses, sweet smiles, and a kind of drooping distinction like that in certain faded Reynolds portraits. Their physical resemblance would have been complete if an elderly embonpoint had not stretched Mrs. Archer's black brocade, while Miss Archer's brown and purple poplins hung, as the years went on, more and more slackly on her virgin frame. Mentally, the likeness between them, as Newland was aware, was less complete than their identical mannerisms often made it appear. The long habit of living together in mutually dependent intimacy had given them the same vocabulary, and the same habit of beginning their phrases, "Mother thinks," or "Janey thinks," according as one or the other wished to advance an opinion of her own. But in reality, while Mrs. Archer's serene unimaginativeness rested easily in the accepted and familiar, Janey was subject to starts and aberrations of fancy, welling up from springs of suppressed romance. Mother and daughter adored each other, and revered their son and brother, and Archer loved them with a tenderness made compunctious and uncritical by the sense of their exaggerated admiration and by his secret satisfaction in it. After all, he thought it a good thing for a man to have his authority respected in his own house, even if his sense of humour sometimes made him question the force of his mandate. On this occasion, the young man was very sure that Mr. Jackson would rather have had him dine out, but he had his own reasons for not doing so. Of course, old Jackson wanted to talk about Ellen Olenska, and of course Mrs. Archer and Janey wanted to hear what he had to tell. All three would be slightly embarrassed by Newland's presence, now that his prospective relation to the Mingott's clan had been made known, and the young man waited with an amused curiosity to see how they would turn the difficulty. They began, obliquely, by talking about Mrs. Lemuel Struthers. "It's a pity the Beauforts asked her," Mrs. Archer said gently, "but then Regina always does what he tells her, and Beaufort—" "Certain nuances escape Beaufort," said Mr. Jackson, cautiously inspecting the broiled shad, and wondering for the 1,000th time why Mrs. Archer's cook always burnt the roe to a cinder. Newland, who had long shared his wonder, could always detect in it the older man's expression of melancholy disapproval. "Oh, necessarily. Beaufort is a vulgar man," said Mrs. Archer. "My grandfather Newland always used to say to my mother, 'Whatever you do, don't let that fellow Beaufort be introduced to the girls.' But at least he's had the advantage of associating with gentlemen. In England, too, they say. It's all very mysterious." She glanced at Janey and paused. She and Janey knew every fold of the Beaufort mystery, but in public Mrs. Archer continued to assume that the subject was not one for the unmarried. "But this Mrs. Struthers," Mrs. Archer continued, "what did you say she was, Sillerton?" "Out of a mine, or rather out of a saloon at the head of the pit, and then living waxworks, touring New England. After the police broke that up, they say she lived—" Mr. Jackson, in his turn, glanced at Janey, whose eyes began to bulge from under her prominent lids. There were still hiatuses for her in Mrs. Struthers' past. "Then," Mr. Jackson continued, and Archer saw he was wondering why no one had told the butler never to slice cucumbers with a steel knife, "then Lemuel Struthers came along. They say his advertiser used the girl's head for the shoe polish posters. Her hair's intensely black, you know, the Egyptian style. Anyhow, he eventually married her." There were volumes of innuendo in the way the "eventually" was spaced, and each syllable was given its due stress. "Oh, well, at the pass we've come to nowadays, it doesn't matter," said Mrs. Archer indifferently. The ladies were not really interested in Mrs. Struthers just then. The subject of Ellen Olenska was too fresh and too absorbing to them. Indeed, Mrs. Struthers' name had been introduced by Mrs. Archer only that she might presently be able to say, "And Newland's new cousin, Countess Olenska, was she at the ball too?" There was a faint touch of sarcasm in the reference to her son, and Archer knew it and had expected it. Even Mrs. Archer, who was seldom unduly pleased with human events, had been altogether glad of her son's engagement, especially after that silly business with Mrs. Rushworth, as she had remarked to Janey, alluding to what had once seemed to Newland a tragedy of which his soul would always bear the scar. There was no better match in New York than May Welland, look at the question from whatever point you chose. Of course, such a marriage was only what Newland was entitled to. But young men are so foolish and incalculable, and some women so ensnaring and unscrupulous, that it was nothing short of a miracle to see one's only son safe past the Siren Isle and in the haven of a blameless domesticity. All this Mrs. Archer felt, and her son knew she felt. But he knew also that she had been perturbed by the premature announcement of his engagement, or rather, by its cause. And it was for that reason, because on the whole he was a tender and indulgent master, that he stayed at home that evening. It's not that I don't approve of the Mingotts' esprit de corps, but why Newland's engagement should be mixed up with that Olenska woman's comings and goings, I don't see, Mrs. Archer grumbled to Janey, the only witness of her slight lapses from perfect sweetness. She had behaved beautifully, and in beautiful behavior she was unsurpassed during the call on Mrs. Welland. But Newland knew, and his betrothed doubtless guessed, that all through the visit she and Janey were nervously on the watch for Madame Olenska's possible intrusion. And when they left the house together, she had permitted herself to say to her son, "I am thankful that Augusta Welland received us alone." These indications of inward disturbance moved Archer the more that he too felt the Mingotts had gone a little too far. But as it was against all the rules of their code that the mother and son should ever allude to what was uppermost in their thoughts, he simply replied, "Oh, well, there's always a phase of family parties to be gone through when one gets engaged, and the sooner it's over the better." At which his mother merely pursed her lips under the lace veil that hung down from her grey velvet bonnet, trimmed with frosted grapes. Her revenge, he felt, her lawful revenge, would be to draw Mr. Jackson that evening on the Countess Olenska, and, having publicly done his duty as a future member of the Mingott clan, the young man had no objection to hearing the lady discussed in private, except that the subject was already beginning to bore him. Mr. Jackson had helped himself to a slice of the tepid fillet which the mournful butler had handed him with a look as sceptical as his own, and had rejected the mushroom sauce after a scarcely perceptible sniff. He looked baffled and hungry, and Archer reflected that he would probably finish his meal on Ellen Olenska. Mr. Jackson leaned back in his chair and glanced up at the candlelit Archers, Newlands, and van der Luydens hanging in dark frames on the dark walls. "Ah, how your grandfather Archer loved a good dinner, my dear Newland," he said, his eyes on the portrait of a plump, full-chested young man in a stock and a blue coat, with a view of a white-columned country house behind him. Well, well, well. I wonder what he would have said to all these foreign marriages. Mr. Archer ignored the allusion to the ancestral cuisine, and Mr. Jackson continued with deliberation. No, she was not at the ball. Ah, Mrs. Archer murmured in a tone that implied she had that decency. Perhaps the Beauforts don't know her, Janey suggested, with artless malice. Mr. Jackson gave a faint sip, as if he had been tasting invisible Madeira. Mrs. Beaufort may not, but Beaufort certainly does, for she was seen walking up Fifth Avenue this afternoon with him by the whole of New York." "Mercy," moaned Mrs. Archer, evidently perceiving the uselessness of trying to ascribe the actions of foreigners to a sense of delicacy. "I wonder if she wears a round hat or a bonnet in the afternoon," Janey speculated. "At the opera I know she had on a dark blue velvet, perfectly plain and flat, like a nightgown." "Janey!" said her mother, and Miss Archer blushed and tried to look audacious. It was, at any rate, in better taste not to go to the ball, Mrs. Archer continued. A spirit of perversity moved her son to rejoin. "I don't think it was a question of taste with her. May said she meant to go and then decided that the dress in question wasn't smart enough." Mrs. Archer smiled at this confirmation of her inference. "Poor Ellen," she simply remarked, adding compassionately, "We must always bear in mind what an eccentric bring-up Medora Manson gave her. What can you expect of a girl who was allowed to wear black satin at her coming-out ball?" "Ah, I don't remember her in it," said Mr. Jackson, adding, "Poor girl," in the tone of one who, while enjoying the memory, had fully understood at the time what the sight portended. "It's odd," Janey remarked, "that she should have kept such an ugly name as Ellen. I should have changed it to Elaine." She glanced about the table to see the effect of this. Her brother laughed. "Why Elaine?" "I don't know. It sounds more Polish," said Janey, blushing. "It sounds more conspicuous, and that can hardly be what she wishes," said Mrs. Archer distantly. "Why not?" broke in her son, growing suddenly argumentative. "Why shouldn't she be conspicuous if she chooses? Why should she slink about as if it were she who had disgraced herself? She's a poor Ellen, certainly, because she had the bad luck to make a wretched marriage. But I don't see that that's a reason for hiding her head as if she were the culprit." "That, I suppose," said Mr. Jackson speculatively, "is the line the Mingotts mean to take." The young man reddened. "I don't have to wait for their cue, if that's what you mean, sir. Madame Olenska has had an unhappy life. That doesn't make her an outcast." "There are rumors," began Mr. Jackson, glancing at Janey. "Oh, I know. The secretary," the young man took him up. "Nonsense, Mother. Janey's a grown-up." "They say, don't they," he went on, "that the secretary helped her to get away from her brute of a husband, who kept her practically a prisoner." "They say, don't they, that the secretary helped her to get away from her brute of a husband, who kept her practically a prisoner. Well, what if he did? I hope there isn't a man among us who wouldn't have done the same thing in such a case." Mr. Jackson glanced over his shoulder to say to the sad little butler, "Perhaps that sauce, just a little, after all." Then, having helped himself, he remarked, "I'm told she's looking for a house. She means to live here." "I hear she means to get a divorce," said Janey boldly. "I hope she will," Archer exclaimed. The word had fallen like a bombshell in the pure and tranquil atmosphere of the Archer dining-room. Mrs. Archer raised her delicate eyebrows in the particular curve that signified the butler, and the young man, himself mindful of the bad taste in discussing such intimate matters in public, hastily branched off into an account of his visit to old Mrs. Mingott. After dinner, according to immemorial custom, Mrs. Archer and Janey trailed their long silk draperies up to the drawing-room, where, while the gentlemen smoked below stairs, they sat beside a Carcel lamp with an engraved globe, facing each other across a rosewood work-table with a green silk bag under it, and stitched at the two ends of a tapestry band of field flowers destined to adorn an occasional chair in the drawing-room of young Mrs. Newland Archer. While this rite was in progress in the drawing-room, Archer settled Mr. Jackson in an armchair near the fire in the Gothic library and handed him a cigar. Mr. Jackson sank into the armchair with satisfaction, lit his cigar with perfect confidence — it was Newland who bought them — and stretching his thin old ankles to the coals, said, "You say the secretary merely helped her to get away, my dear fellow? Well, he was still helping her a year later then, for somebody met 'em living at Lausanne together." Newland reddened. Living together? Well, why not? Who had the right to make her life over if she hadn't? I am sick of the hypocrisy that would bury alive a woman of her age if her husband prefers to live with harlots. He stopped and turned away angrily to light his cigar. Women ought to be free as we are, he declared, making a discovery of which he was too irritated to measure the terrific consequences. Mr. Sillerton Jackson stretched his ankles near the coals and emitted a sardonic whistle. "Well," he said after a pause, "apparently Count Olenska takes your view, for I never heard of his having lifted a finger to get his wife back." Chapter 6. That evening, after Mr. Jackson had taken himself away, and the ladies had retired to their chintz-curtained bedroom, Newland Archer mounted thoughtfully to his own study. A vigilant hand had, as usual, kept the fire alive and the lamp trimmed, and the room, with its rows and rows of books, its bronze and steel statuettes of the fencers on the mantelpiece, and its many photographs of famous pictures, looked homelike and welcoming. As he dropped into his armchair near the fire, his eyes rested on a large photograph of May Welland, which the young girl had given him in the first days of their romance, and which had now displaced all the other portraits on the table. With a new sense of awe, he looked at the frank forehead, serious eyes, and gay, innocent mouth of the young creature whose soul's custodian he was to be. That terrifying product of the social system he belonged to and believed in, the young girl who knew nothing and expected everything, looked back at him like a stranger through May Welland's familiar features. And once more it was borne in on him that marriage was not the safe anchorage he had been taught to think, but a voyage on uncharted seas. The case of the Countess Olenska had stirred up old, settled convictions and set them drifting dangerously through his mind. His own exclamation, "Women should be free as we are," struck to the root of a problem that it was agreed in his world to regard as non-existent. Nice women, however wronged, would never claim the kind of freedom he meant, and generous-minded men like himself were therefore, in the heat of argument, the more chivalrously ready to concede it to them. Such verbal generosities were, in fact, only a humbugging disguise of the inexorable conventions that tied things together and bound people down to the old pattern. But here he was, pledged to defend on the part of his betrothed's cousin conduct that, on his own wife's part, would justify him in calling down on her all the thunders of church and state. Of course, the dilemma was purely hypothetical. Since he wasn't a blackguard Polish nobleman, it was absurd to speculate what his wife's rights would be if he were. But Newland Archer was too imaginative not to feel that, in his case and May's, the tie might gall for reasons far less gross and palpable. What could he and she really know of each other, since it was his duty as a decent fellow to conceal his past from her, and hers, as a marriageable girl, to have no past to conceal? What if, for some one of the subtler reasons that would tell with both of them, they should tire of each other, misunderstand or irritate each other. He reviewed his friends' marriages, the supposedly happy ones, and saw none that answered even remotely to the passionate and tender comradeship which he pictured as his permanent relation with May Welland. He perceived that such a picture presupposed, on her part, the experience, the versatility, the freedom of judgment, which she had been carefully trained not to possess. And with a shiver of foreboding, he saw his marriage becoming what most of the other marriages about him were, a dull association of material and social interests, held together by ignorance on the one side and hypocrisy on the other. Lawrence Lefferts occurred to him as the husband who had most completely realized this enviable ideal. As became the high priest of form, he had formed a wife so completely to his own convenience that, in the most conspicuous moments of his frequent love affairs with other men's wives, she went about in smiling unconsciousness, saying that Lawrence was so frightfully strict, and had been known to blush indignantly and avert her gaze when someone alluded in her presence to the fact that Julius Beaufort, as became a foreigner of doubtful origin, had what was known in New York as another establishment. Archer tried to console himself with the thought that he was not quite such an ass as Larry Lefferts, nor May such a simpleton as poor Gertrude. But the difference was, after all, one of intelligence and not of standards. In reality, they all lived in a kind of hieroglyphic world, where the real thing was never said, or done, or even thought, but only represented by a set of arbitrary signs, as when Mrs. Welland, who knew exactly why Archer had pressed her to announce her daughter's engagement at the Beaufort ball, and had indeed expected him to do no less, yet felt obliged to simulate reluctance and the air of having her hand forced, quite as in the books on primitive man that people of advanced cultures were beginning to read, the savage bride is dragged with shrieks from her parents' tent. The result, of course, was that the young girl who was the center of this elaborate system of mystification remained the more inscrutable for her very frankness and assurance. She was frank, poor darling, because she had nothing to conceal, assured because she knew of nothing to be on her guard against, and with no better preparation than this, she was to be plunged overnight into what people evasively called the facts of life. The young man was sincerely, but placidly, in love. He delighted in the radiant good looks of his betrothed, in her health, her horsemanship, her grace and quickness at games, and the shy interest in books and ideas that she was beginning to develop under his guidance. She had advanced far enough to join him in ridiculing the idols of the king, but not to feel the beauty of Ulysses and the lotus-eaters. She was straightforward, loyal, and brave. She had a sense of humor, chiefly proved by her laughing at his jokes, and he suspected, in the depths of her innocently gazing soul, a glow of feeling that it would be a joy to waken. But when he had gone the brief round of her, he returned discouraged by the thought that all this frankness and innocence were only an artificial product. Untrained human nature was not frank and innocent. It was full of the twists and defenses of an instinctive guile. And he felt himself oppressed by this creation of facetious purity so cunningly manufactured by a conspiracy of mothers and aunts and grandmothers and long-dead ancestresses, because it was supposed to be what he wanted, what he had a right to, in order that he might exercise his lordly pleasure in smashing it like an image made of snow. There was a certain triteness in these reflections. They were those habitual to young men on the approach of their wedding day. But they were generally accompanied by a sense of compunction and self-abasement of which Newland Archer felt no trace. He could not deplore, as Thackeray's heroes so often exasperated him by doing, that he had not a blank page to offer his bride in exchange for the unblemished one she was to give to him. He could not get away from the fact that if he had been brought up as she had, they would have been no more fit to find their way about than the babes in the wood. Nor could he, for all his anxious cogitations, see any honest reason, that is, unconnected with his own momentary pleasure and the passion of masculine vanity, why his bride should not have been allowed the same freedom of experience as himself. Such questions, at such an hour, were bound to drift through his mind, but he was conscious that their uncomfortable persistence and precision were due to the inopportune arrival of the Countess Olenska. Here he was, at the very moment of his betrothal, a moment for pure thoughts and cloudless hopes, pitchforked into a coil of scandal which raised all the special problems he could have preferred to let lie. "Hang Ellen Olenska," he grumbled, as he covered his fire and began to undress. He could not really see why her fate should have the least bearing on his, yet he dimly felt that he had only just begun to measure the risks of the championship which his engagement had forced upon him. A few days later, the bolt fell. The Lovell Mingotts had sent out cards for what was known as a formal dinner, that is, 3 extra footmen, 2 dishes for each course, and a Roman punch in the middle, and had headed their invitations with the words, "To meet the Countess Olenska," in accordance with the hospitable American fashion, which treats strangers as if they were royalty, or at least as their ambassadors. The guests had been selected with a boldness and discrimination in which the initiated recognized the firm hand of Catherine the Great. Associated with such immemorial standbys as the Selfridge Marys, who were asked everywhere because they always had been, the Beauforts, on whom there was a claim of relationship, and Mr. Sillerton Jackson and his sister Sophie, who went wherever her brother told her to, were some of the most fashionable and yet most irreproachable of the dominant young married set. The Lawrence Leffertses, Mrs. Lefferts Rushworth, the lovely widow, the Harry Thorleys, the Reggie Chiverses, and young Morris Dagonet and his wife, who was a van der Luyden. The company, indeed, was perfectly assorted, since all the members belonged to the little inner group of people who, during the long New York season, disported themselves together daily and nightly with apparently undiminished zest. 48 hours later, the unbelievable had happened. Everyone had refused the Mingotts' invitation, except the Beauforts and old Mr. Jackson and his sister. The intended slight was emphasized by the fact that even the Reggie Chiverses, who were of the Mingott clan, were among those inflicting it, and by the uniform wording of the notes, in all of which the writers regretted that they were unable to accept, without the mitigating plea of a previous engagement that ordinary courtesy prescribed. New York society was, in those days, far too small and too scant in its resources for everyone in it, including livery-stable keepers, butlers, and cooks, not to know exactly on which evenings people were free. And it was thus possible for the recipients of Mrs. Lovell Mingott's invitations to make cruelly clear their determination not to meet the Countess Olenska. The blow was unexpected, but the Mingotts, as their way was, met it gallantly. Mrs. Lovell Mingott confided the case to Mrs. Welland, who confided it to Newland Archer, who, aflame at the outrage, appealed passionately and authoritatively to his mother, who, after a painful period of inward resistance and outward temporizing, succumbed to his instances, as she always did, and immediately embracing his cause with an energy redoubled by her previous hesitations, put on her grey velvet bonnet and said, "I'll go and see Louisa van der Luyden." The New York of Newland Archer's day was a small and slippery pyramid, in which, as yet, hardly a fissure had been made or a foothold gained. At its base was a firm foundation of what Mrs. Archer called plain people, an honourable but obscure majority of respectable families who, as in the case of the Spicers, or the Leffertses, or the Jacksons, had been raised above their level by marriage with one of the ruling clans. People, Mrs. Archer always said, were not as particular as they used to be, and with old Catherine Spicer ruling one end of Fifth Avenue, and Julius Beaufort the other, you couldn't expect the old traditions to last much longer. Firmly narrowing upward from the wealthy but inconspicuous substratum was the compact and dominant group which the Mingotts, Newlands, Chiverseys, and Mansons so actively represented. Most people imagined them to be the very apex of the pyramid, but they themselves, at least those of Mrs. Archer's generation, were aware that, in the eyes of the professional genealogist, only a still smaller number of families could claim that eminence. "Don't tell me," Mrs. Archer would say to her children, "all this modern newspaper rubbish about a New York aristocracy. If there is one, neither the Mingotts nor the Mansons belong to it. No, nor the Newlands or the Chiverseys either. Our grandfathers and great-grandfathers were just respectable English or Dutch merchants, who came to the colonies to make their fortune and stayed because they did so well. One of your grandfathers signed the Declaration, and another was a general on Washington's staff. These are things to be proud of, but they have nothing to do with rank or class. New York has always been a commercial community, and there are not more than 3 families in it who can claim an aristocratic origin in the real sense of the word." Mrs. Archer and her son and daughter, like everyone else in New York, knew who these privileged beings were. The Dagonets of Washington Square, who came of an old English county family, allied with the Pitts and the Foxes. The Lannings, who had intermarried with the descendants of Count de Grasse. And the van der Luydens, direct descendants of the first Dutch governor of Manhattan, and related, by pre-revolutionary marriages, to several members of the French and British aristocracy. The Lannings survived only in the person of 2 very old but lively Miss Lannings, who lived cheerfully and reminiscently among family portraits and Chippendale. The Dagonets were a considerable clan, allied to the best names in Baltimore and Philadelphia, but the van der Luydens, who stood above all of them, had faded into a kind of super-terrestrial twilight, from which only 2 figures impressively emerged, those of Mr. and Mrs. Henry van der Luyden. Mrs. Henry van der Luyden had been Louisa Dagonet, and her mother had been the grandmother of Colonel Dulac, of an old Channel Island family who had fought under Cornwallis and had settled in Maryland after the war, with his bride, Lady Angelica Trevenna, 5th daughter of the Earl of St. Austry. The tie between the Dagonets, the Dulacs of Maryland, and their aristocratic Cornish kinfolk, the Trevennas, had always remained close and cordial. Mr. and Mrs. van der Luyden had more than once paid long visits to the present head of the House of Trevenna, the Duke of St. Austry, at his county seat in Cornwall, and at St. Austry in Gloucestershire, and his Grace had frequently announced his intention of some day returning their visit, without the Duchess, who feared the Atlantic. Mr. and Mrs. van der Luyden divided their time between Trevenna, their place in Maryland, and their great estate on the Hudson, which had been one of the colonial grants of the Dutch government to the famous first governor, and of which Mr. van der Luyden was still patroon. Their large, solemn house in Madison Avenue was seldom opened, and when they came to town they received in it only their most intimate friends. "I wish you would go with me, Newland," his mother said suddenly, pausing at the door of the brown coupe. "Louisa is fond of you, and, of course, it's on account of dear May that I'm taking this step, and also because, if we don't all stand together, there'll be no such thing as society left." Chapter 7. Mrs. Henry van der Luyden listened in silence to her cousin Mrs. Archer's narrative. It was all very well to tell yourself in advance that Mrs. van der Luyden was always silent, and that, though non-committal by nature and training, she was very kind to those people she really liked. Even personal experience of these facts was not always a protection from the chill that descended on one in the high-ceilinged, white-walled Madison Avenue drawing-room, with the pale brocaded armchairs so obviously uncovered for the occasion, and the gauze still veiling the ormolu mantel ornaments, and the beautiful old carved frame of Gainsborough's Lady Angelica du Lac. Mrs. van der Luyden's portrait by Huntington, in black velvet and Venetian point, faced that of her lovely ancestress. It was generally considered as fine as a cabanel, and though 20 years had elapsed since its execution, was still a perfect likeness. Indeed, the Mrs. van der Luyden who sat beneath it, listening to Mrs. Archer, might have been the twin sister of the fair and still youngish woman drooping against a gilt armchair before a green rep curtain. Mrs. van der Luyden still wore black velvet and Venetian point when she went into society, or rather, since she never dined out, when she threw open her own doors to receive it. Her fair hair, which had faded without turning grey, was still parted in flat, overlapping points on her forehead, and the straight nose that divided her pale blue eyes was only a little more pinched about the nostrils than when the portrait had been painted. She always, indeed, struck Newland Archer as having been rather gruesomely preserved in the airless atmosphere of a perfectly irreproachable existence, as bodies caught in glaciers keep for years a rosy life in death. Like all his family, he esteemed and admired Mrs. van der Luyden, but he found her gentle, bending sweetness less approachable than the grimness of some of his mother's old aunts, fierce spinsters who said no on principle before they knew what they were going to be asked. Mrs. van der Luyden's attitude said neither yes nor no, but always appeared to incline to clemency, till her thin lips, wavering into the shadow of a smile, made the almost invariable reply, "I shall first have to talk this over with my husband." She and Mr. van der Luyden were so exactly alike that Archer often wondered how, after 40 years of the closest conjugality, two such merged identities ever separated themselves enough for anything as controversial as a talking over. But as neither had ever reached a decision without prefacing it by this mysterious conclave, Mrs. Archer and her son, having set forth their case, waited resignedly for the familiar phrase. Mrs. van der Luyden, however, who had seldom surprised anyone, now surprised them by reaching her long hand towards the bell-rope. "I think," she said, "I should like Henry to hear what you have told me." A footman appeared, to whom she gravely added, "If Mr. van der Luyden has finished reading the newspaper, please ask him to be kind enough to come." She said reading the newspaper in a tone in which a minister's wife might have said presiding at a cabinet meeting, not from any arrogance of mind, but because the habit of a lifetime and the attitude of her friends and relations had led her to consider Mr. van der Luyden's least gesture as having an almost sacerdotal importance. Her promptness of action showed that she considered the case as pressing as Mrs. Archer. But, lest she should be thought to have committed herself in advance, she added, with the sweetest look, "Henry always enjoys seeing you, dear Adeline, and he will wish to congratulate Newland." The double doors had solemnly reopened, and between them appeared Mr. Henry van der Luyden, tall, spare, and frock-coated, with faded fair hair, a straight nose like his wife's, and the same look of frozen gentleness in eyes that were merely pale grey instead of pale blue. Mr. van der Luyden greeted Mrs. Archer with cousinly affability, preferred to Newland low-voiced congratulations couched in the same language as his wife's, and seated himself in one of the brocade armchairs with the simplicity of a reigning sovereign. "I had just finished reading the Times," he said, laying his long fingertips together. "In town my mornings are so much occupied that I find it more convenient to read the newspapers after luncheon." "Oh, there's a great deal to be said for that plan. Indeed, I think my Uncle Edgemont used to say he found it less agitating not to read the morning papers till after dinner," said Mrs. Archer responsively. "Yes, my good father abhorred hurry. But now we live in a constant rush," said Mr. van der Luyden in measured tones, looking with pleasant deliberation about the large, shrouded room, which to Archer was so complete an image of its owners. "But I hope you had finished your reading, Henry," his wife interposed. "Quite, quite," he reassured her. "Then I should like Adeline to tell you—" "Oh, it's really Newland's story," said his mother, smiling, and proceeded to rehearse once more the monstrous tale of the affront inflicted on Mrs. Lovell Mingott. "Of course," she ended, "Augusta Welland and Mary Mingott both felt that, especially in view of Newland's engagement, you and Henry ought to know." "Ah," said Mr. van der Luyden, drawing a deep breath. There was a silence, during which the tick of the monumental ormolu clock on the white marble mantelpiece grew as loud as the boom of a minute-gun. Archer contemplated with awe the two slender, faded figures, seated side by side, in a kind of vice-regal rigidity, mouthpieces of some remote ancestral authority which fate compelled them to wield when they would so much rather have lived in simplicity and seclusion, digging invisible weeds out of the perfect lawns of Scoider Cliff, and playing patience together in the evenings. Mr. van der Luyden was the first to speak. "You really think this is due to some intentional interference of Lawrence Lefferts?" he inquired, turning to Archer. "I'm certain of it, sir. Larry has been going at it rather harder than usual lately, if Cousin Louisa won't mind my mentioning it, having a rather stiff affair with the postmaster's wife in their village, or someone of that sort. And whenever poor Gertrude Lefferts begins to suspect anything, and he's afraid of trouble, he gets up a fuss of this kind to show how awfully moral he is, and talks at the top of his voice about the impertinence of inviting his wife to meet people he doesn't wish her to know. He's simply using Madame Olenska as a lightning rod. I've seen him try the same thing often before." "The Leffertses," said Mrs. van der Luyden. "The Leffertses," echoed Mrs. Archer. "What would Uncle Edgemont have said of Lawrence Lefferts pronouncing on anybody's social position? It shows what society has come to." "Well, we'll hope it has not quite come to that," said Mr. van der Luyden firmly. "Oh, if only you and Louisa went out more," sighed Mrs. Archer. But instantly she became aware of her mistake. The van der Luydens were morbidly sensitive to any criticism of their secluded existence. They were the arbiters of fashion, the court of last appeal, and they knew it, and bowed to their fate. But being shy and retiring persons, with no natural inclination for their part, they lived as much as possible in the sylvan solitude of Scoider Cliff, and when they came to town declined all invitations on the plea of Mrs. van der Luyden's health. Newland Archer came to his mother's rescue. "Everybody in New York knows what you and Cousin Louisa represent. That's why Mrs. Mingott felt she ought not to allow this slight on Countess Olenska to pass without consulting you." Mrs. van der Luyden glanced at her husband, who glanced back at her. "It is the principle that I dislike," said Mr. van der Luyden. "As long as a member of a well-known family is backed up by that family, it should be considered final." "It seems so to me," said his wife, as if she were producing a new thought. "I had no idea," Mr. van der Luyden continued, "that things had come to such a pass." He paused and looked at his wife again. "It occurs to me, my dear, that the Countess Olenska is already a sort of relation, through Medora Manson's first husband. At any rate, she will be when Newland marries." He turned towards the young man. "Have you read this morning's Times, Newland?" "Why, yes, sir," said Archer, who usually tossed off half a dozen papers with his morning coffee. Husband and wife looked at each other again. Their pale eyes clung together in prolonged and serious consultation. Then a faint smile fluttered over Mrs. van der Luyden's face. She had evidently guessed and approved. Mr. van der Luyden turned to Mrs. Archer. "If Louisa's health allowed her to dine out, I wish you would say to Mrs. Lovell Mingott, she and I would have been happy to fill the places of the Lawrence Leffertses at her dinner." He paused to let the irony of this sink in. "As you know, this is impossible." Mrs. Archer sounded a sympathetic assent. "But Newland tells me he has read this morning's Times, therefore he has probably seen that Louisa's relative, the Duke of St. Austrey, arrives next week on the Russia. He is coming in to enter his new sloop, the Guinevere, in next summer's International Cup race, and also to have a little canvasback shooting at Trevenna." Mr. van der Luyden paused again, and continued with increasing benevolence. "Before taking him down to Maryland, we are inviting a few friends to meet him here, only a little dinner, with a reception afterwards. I am sure Louisa will be as glad as I am if Countess Olenska will let us include her among our guests." He got up, bent his long body with a stiff friendliness towards his cousin, and added, "I think I have Louisa's authority for saying that she will herself leave the invitation to dine when she drives out presently, with our cards, of course, with our cards." Mrs. Archer, who knew this to be a hint, but the 17-hand chestnuts, which were never kept waiting, were at the door, rose with a hurried murmur of thanks. Mrs. van der Luyden beamed on her, but her husband raised a protesting hand. "There is nothing to thank me for, dear Adeline, nothing at all. This kind of thing must not happen in New York. It shall not, as long as I can help it," he pronounced with sovereign gentleness as he steered his cousins to the door. 2 hours later, everyone knew that the great sea-spring barouche in which Mrs. van der Luyden took the air at all seasons had been seen at old Mrs. Mingott's door, where a large square envelope was handed in. And that evening, at the opera, Mr. Sillerton Jackson was able to state that the envelope contained a card inviting the Countess Olenska to the dinner which the van der Luydens were giving the following week for their cousin, the Duke of St. Austrey. Some of the younger men in the club box exchanged a smile at this announcement, and glanced sideways at Lawrence Lefferts, who sat carelessly in the front of the box, pulling his long, fair moustache, and who remarked with authority as the soprano paused, No one but Patty ought to attempt the somnambula.